There's a very interesting sefer that I have in my own library. I have 2 volumes of it. I'm not sure if it's more than 2 or not, but it's called Eretz Yisrael B'Sifrot HaTshuvot. And it's all about Eretz Yisrael in early responsa. It's by Rabbi Yisrael Shapansky, and it's published by Mossad Rav Kook and Moriah in New York. I'm just looking for a year. 1966 is the publication date. It's got some fascinating tshuvas of the Gaonim on various topics that surround Eretz Yisrael. One chapter is devoted to tshuvas of Gaonim as to why we study Talmud Bavli over Talmud Yerushalmi. And there's been a lot of discussion. One of the things we know is that there's a long-standing tradition that starts with the Rishonim, actually goes back to the times of the Gaonim, that even though people are aware of Talmud Yerushalmi, there's a preference given to Talmud Bavli, a preference to study it. The Gemara in many Gemaras in the Bavli make reference to the fact that at some point in history there's a difference of methodology of study among the Babylonians over the Bnei Eretz Yisrael. Sometimes the Bnei Yisrael are extolled in their virtue of study, and sometimes the Babylonians are extolled, and sometimes the Babylonians are insulted, and we'll see some of those references being made this evening. Most of the tshuvas that we have that we're going to see go back to the times of the Gaonim to try and explain why the Bavli is preferred over the Yerushalmi, what we call the Palestinian Talmud versus the Babylonian Talmud. And our first stop is going to be from a very interesting Gaonic person whose name is Pirkoi ben Baboy. And the only way we know about this person, Pirkoi ben Baboy, is from the Cairo Geniza, which was discovered in the 19th century by Solomon Schechter. And a lot of it was written about Pirkoi ben Baboy by Ginsburg, who writes extensively, Louis Ginsburg writes extensively about Geniza material, but especially responsa that come from the Gaonic period. So who was Pirkoi ben Baboy? I'm quoting here from the Encyclopedia Judaica. He lives during the 8th through the 9th centuries. He was a Talmudic scholar of the Gaonic era and author of a polemical halachic work. The word polemical is very important because Ben Baboy, Pirkoi this is a Persian name. He is living in Bavel, and he is a person who makes an attempt in his writing that we find in the Geniza to be politically persuasive to Jews throughout the world that they should follow the minhagim of Bavel over minhagim of Eretz Yisrael. And his primary mode of argumentation as to why it's important to follow minhagei Bavel over minhagei Eretz Yisrael is that many of minhagei Eretz Yisrael are inferior because Mesorah was compromised in Eretz Yisrael. There were long periods of what we call shmad in Eretz Yisrael by the time we get to the Gaonic period, and therefore there's more legitimacy and faithfulness to the Mesorah among the minhagim of Bavel. That's what Pirkoi ben Baboy's whole thesis is, and he is, to whatever extent he is successful, we know that many of the minhagim of Bavel were adopted by most communities, even by communities in Eretz Yisrael at some point in the Gaonic period. One example that I've written about in an article is about the minhag of reciting Kedusha. Originally, the minhag to recite Kedusha in Chazaras HaShatz was reserved exclusively for Shabbos and Yom Tov. This is what's brought down in Maseches Sofrim, which records minhagei Eretz Yisrael. And the minhag Bavel was to recite Kedusha every day. Pirkoi ben Baboy writes that the only reason why Jews in Eretz Yisrael recite Kedusha on Shabbos and Yom Tov and not every day is because of Shmad, is because there were long periods when the Byzantines were occupying Eretz Yisrael, and they suppressed religious expression, and therefore the only time that the Jews had respite to be able to do certain practices was on Shabbos and Yontif. You're probably familiar with the famous Shmad argument as to why we say Shema Yisrael in the Kedusha of Musaf on Shabbos, because the argument goes that there was a time of Shmad originally when Jews were not permitted to recite Shema, and sentries were placed at the doors of the synagogues on Shabbos to make sure that Jews would not recite Kriya Shema. So they had to wait until the sentries left, until the Shacharis service was over, and the only time that they had an opportunity to say Shema B'tzibor was in Musaf by the time the guards left, and that's why they left, and they put Shema in Musaf. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's at least one theory as to why Shema is in Kedusha. Okay? So I just wanted to let you know a little bit more. He is a pupil of Abba, who was a pupil of Yehudoi Gaon of Sura. Pirkoi notes that it was only because of their teaching and tradition that he presumed to write to the scholars of Kirun. And Kirun, it was a major Torah center in Tunisia where Jews lived for many, many decades, until one day, as is always the story of the Jewish people, they were chased out, this time by Muslim extremists. And anyway, it goes through the history of Pirkoi ben Baboy. You can look it up; it's online. And his writing, his famous Igeret, which we're going to see some snippets of, reflects his aspiration to make the Babylonian Talmud the authoritative code for world Jewry. Echoes of the long drawn-out struggle between the two Torah centers, Eretz Yisrael and Babylon, are heard in the polemical chapters of Pirkoi, which constitute, in Ginsburg's view, the earliest halachic work extant from the Gaonic era. Okay. So that's also disputed as to actually where he lived. Some say that he was born in Bavel, where he studied and wrote his Igeret. But according to Ginsburg, he was a native of Eretz Yisrael who studied in Bavel, where he settled and wrote his work. Everyone agrees that he lived in Bavel, and therefore he tried to prevail upon world Jewry to accept Minhagei Bavel. It is probable that Pirkoi's words in his Igeret God established places of learning, which we'll see that inside. He writes that the communal leaders and scholars of Kirun endeavored to maintain places of learning in the town as well as in various localities in Spain. Emigrants who left Kirun for Spain founded Torah centers there. And so Pirkoi ben Baboy was trying to write to these Jews who had preserved a lot of the minhagim, and he complains about the pupils of the Babylonian academies who learned the customs of Eretz Yisrael, arrived in North Africa, and were then drawn after the ignorant customs and habits of Eretz Yisrael. In his view, any custom or ruling which is not in accordance with the law and halacha of the Babylonian Talmud is a consequence of the apostasy decreed by the wicked kingdom of Edom upon Eretz Yisrael. As a result, Torah was forgotten by the inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael, and the Eretz Yisrael customs came to be customs of apostasy. Pirkoi, as a pro-Babylonian, stresses the superiority of the Babylonian academies as the only source in the world for the details of the oral law, and says that it is fitting that from them the Torah should go forth to Jews in all countries. In the opinion of many scholars, this polemic of Pirkoi also had an anti-Karaite purpose to ensure that the denial of the oral law by Karaites should not detach the Jews from the tradition customary in the Babylonian academies. Okay, so you see that he has an agenda, this Pirkoi ben Baboy, in a lot of the things that he writes. It should be noted that there are some scholars who say that Pirkoi ben Baboy over-exaggerated the amount of shmad that was prevalent in Eretz Yisrael, and he did so for polemic reasons in order to try to create uniformity of practice and have everyone accept Minhagei Bavel. And we find this as well even in some of the Rishonim, who say, for example, that the minhag of Eretz Yisrael to recite Kaddish only one day a week on Shabbos instead of all 7 days a week has nothing to do with Shmad, but rather is based on the fact on a midrashic premise that angels have 6 wings, and it is proper for the angels recite Kedusha, and Klal Yisrael recites Kedusha. But there's no need for the Klal Yisrael to recite Kedusha when the angels are reciting Kedusha, and because they have 6 wings, that represents the 6 days of the week when the Malachim are reciting Kedusha, and it's only necessary for Jews to recite Kedusha on the one day when the Malachim are not. So you see, and there are other arguments to be made, that Pirkei ben Baboy was somewhat exaggerative in his condemnation of Minhagei Eretz Yisrael for polemic reasons, and there's a lot more that's written about this. There are some who argue, although it's never that simple, that Minhagei Ashkenaz are based on Minhagei Eretz Yisrael, and Minhagei Sfarad, eventually Jews who migrated to Spain and remained in African areas, are based on Minhagei Bavel. Of course, it's never that simple. There's a lot of crisscrossing and mismatching, but that's the way it is. Let's take a look at snippets from Pirkei ben Baboy's writings that are found in the Geniza. So it's on the first page here. Me'emasai v'lama he'edifu ha-Talmud Bavli ala Yerushalmi Michtavei Pirkei ben Baboy, or Mikisvei Pirkei ben Baboy. He says, Va'af HaKadosh Baruch Hu karas brisim Yisrael. Everyone see at the bottom of the first column, first page, I should say page Yudches. He says, Hashem made a covenant with Israel, Shelo tishtakach Torah sheba'al peh mipihem u'mipizaram ad sof kol hadoros. That Hashem made a covenant that the Torah sheba'al peh should never be forgotten from the mouths of the Jewish people or their descendants ad infinitum for all generations. Ulefichach kava HaKadosh Baruch Hu shtei yeshivos liYisrael shahogin b'Torah yomam v'layla. And that's why Hashem established 2 yeshivas. He's referring to 2 Babylonian yeshivas, Surah and Pumbedisa, where the Jews would study Torah day and night. Umiskabsim shtei pamim b'shana ba'adaru ve'elul mikol mikomos. And they would also, they had this practice that the Gemara talks about many times called the Yarchei Kala, where there were 2 months out of the year where they would have an intensified program of study, so that they would ask all farmers and all the Balabatim to come to the yeshiva during that time, once in Adar and once in Elul, right before the main farming months of Tishrei and Nisan. Mikol Mekomos Venosin b'Milchamta Shel Torah Ad Shemamidim Dover al Buryo V'Halacha La'amita. And the reason why these yeshivas were so successful is because they had this intensified study where they would be nosei v'nosei, go back and forth in the war of Torah. And the Gemara alludes to this fact that in Bavel there was a much more confrontational approach, a much more dialectical approach to the study of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is why they were successful in being able to arrive at truth of Torah Sheba'al Peh more so than in Eretz Yisrael, where people were much more conciliatory. In other words, sometimes it's good to be edgy in your personality when you're studying Torah Sheba'al Peh, because edginess and your ability to challenge and to fight and to struggle helps you arrive at the truth. Va'osan shtei yeshivos lo ra'u lo shviva lo shmad v'lo shalal. So it's, first of all, it's Pirkei ben Baboy's contention that these 2 yeshivas of Surah and Pumbedisa never saw any strife or persecution. That these 2 yeshivas were left unmolested for, literally, as you'll see, centuries. V'lo sholat bahen lo Yavan v'lo Edom. Greece and Rome never harmed these centers of learning. It's his contention that the centers of learning in certain Pumbedisa and Bavel go all the way back to the times of, certainly Bayis Sheni, but as we'll see, that he says that they go back to the original Babylonian exile after the Churban of Bayis Rishon, and that these centers were started, and that they were left there even when many Jews went back to build Bayis Sheni. These centers were always there. Whether that's true or not, it seems historically to be not so accurate, because we don't really have a record of Surah and Pumbedisa until the times of the Amoraim. Right. But this is what he writes. And this is indicative of the polemical nature of his argumentation. He says, V'hotzian HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yud Beishana Kodem Churban Habayis B'Torasan U'V'Talmudan. He says HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused these Torah centers of learning to go from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz 12 years before the Churban of the first temple. Shekach Siv V'Higla Es Kol Yerushalayim Ves Kol Giborei HaChayil V'Goymer. And this is what Chazal mean, basing themselves on a pasuk in Melachim that says that Hashem exiled all that were in Jerusalem and all of the Giborei HaChayil, the mighty warriors. So the Medrash Tanchuma asks, V'chima Gvura Yesh Bivnei Adam HaHolchim Bagoyla. What do you mean the mighty warriors were sent into exile? Since when do mighty warriors flee? Mighty warriors fight. Why does it say that the mighty warriors were sent into exile? Ela Elu Giborei Torah. This refers to not warriors on the battlefield, but warriors in the Beis Medrash. These were people who were very, very fierce in their Torah study. Shimlo Galu Kodem HaChurban Habayis V'Yatzu LeBavel Ha'isa Torah Sheba'al Peh Mishtakachas MiYisrael B'Golus Tzidkiyah. And this was all part of the divine plan that the sages of Jerusalem should exile themselves to Bavel, and that was done before the Churban, because if they had remained in Eretz Yisrael during the times of Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, their Torah would have been forgotten and destroyed. Ubris shekaras HaKadosh Baruch Hu im Yisrael shelo tishtakach Torah sheba'al peh mehem. And it was this covenant that God made, that this Torah that started in Yerushalayim and exiled itself to Bavel would never be forgotten. Bizchusa hotzian HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yerushalayim leBavel kodem churban habayis b'shalom. That's why Hashem caused these warriors of Torah to exile themselves before the Churban, so that there should always be an unmolested and undisturbed center of Torah where the Torah would always be perpetuated in peace. Both b'shalom b'torasan, b'shalom b'gufan, b'shalom b'nishoseihen, u'v'neihem, u'v'noseihem. And that the people should live in peace, and that way their Torah could flourish. Shekach ksiv hoi tzion himolti yosheves bas Bavel, that it says, and this is from Zechariah, woe, O Zion, flee to she who dwells in Bavel. V'yashu b'Bavel ad hayom hazeh v'ad ad yavo Mashiach ben David v'yigal es Yisrael. And they have dwelled, these Torah scholars who were exiled all the way back before the Churban Bayis Rishon, have lived in Bavel since that time, and they will continue living there until the coming of Mashiach at the time of redemption. Now, Pirkei ben Baboy is clearly mistaken about the future, because we know that there are no more Torah centers in Sur and Pumbedisa, or for that matter, anywhere in Bavel. But of course, he's prognosticating based upon the strength of these Torah centers during his time.
When did he live? Around
8th and 9th centuries.
So much later, after the Mongol invasion.
He's from the Gaonic period. There still is a strong Babylonian Jewish community presence. Very strong.
Yeah, but they didn't live exactly in peace during that period of time either. Mongol invasion.
Well, I guess it's all relative. There's relative peace. The view during his period of time is that the Byzantines are much more harmful, the Christian world is much more harmful to the Jewish people than the Muslim world. This is before the rise of the radical Islamic caliphate. There's a relatively moderate Islamic caliphate at this time in the Middle East, so things are relatively calm. He says, Yehi ratzon milifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheyavi lanu Mashiach ben David b'mehera v'yigol es Yisrael shekach ksiv. May it be Hashem's will that Mashiach come quickly and redeem Israel, as it says in Micha, Choli vagochi bas Tzion ki yoleida ki ata teitzi mikirya v'shachant b'sadeh uvas ad halom sham tinasli v'sham yigalech Hashem mikol oyevayech. That you will rejoice, O daughter of Zion, because you will come to this place and be redeemed from all of your enemies. Mikanat halamed mi pasuk zeh. And from here you see, from this pasuk, because it says, Teitzi mikirya, v'shachant b'sadeh, that you will leave the capital and you will dwell in the field. He says this is a reference to the fact, he says, Shemashiach ugula lebavel ba'a techila, that Moshiach and redemption will come to Bavel first. And as the footnote, if you take a look in footnote 11, he writes like this. He says, "Midvarim elu nira she'im golas tzidkiya huchana Bavel me'esa hashgacha lemerkaz haTorah." He says it seems from this argument of Pirkoi ben Baboy that already from the times of Golus Bayis Rishon, that we find that Bavel is established as a Torah center. The ulai poskim mitam zeh tamid keTalmud Bavli. This is the argument that Pirkoi ben Baboy is trying to make, that it's for this reason that Talmud Bavli has greater strength than Talmud Eretz Yisrael. Ela shelafi nimok zeh min haroi hayalahadiv Torahs Bavel mimei golas sidkiya v'harei yadua. He says the argument, however, is a little bit problematic. He says because according to this, if the Mesorah is stronger in Bavel, going all the way back to Golas Tzidkiya, going back to Bayis Rishon, he says, but that's not true because v'harei yadua shebitkufa mukdemes bizman haTalmud he'edifu Toras Eretz Yisrael kemo shekasvu Rav Hai Gaon v'aviv Rav Shrir Gaon. As we'll see shortly from other Gaonim, that there was a time when the Torah of Eretz Yisrael was more ascendant and stronger than the Torah, than the Talmud study of Bavli. In other words, today when we say that Talmud Bavli is more authoritative, it's not that it's only that way at one point in history, but at an earlier period of history, Torah's Eretz Yisrael was superior. But according to Pirkoi ben Baboy's line of reasoning, Talmud Bavli, the study of Bavli, was always more powerful. So that's the problem that he's going to leave us with. And as I mentioned, much of what Ben Baboy writes is polemic in nature. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. He may not be speaking with historical accuracy, and he's really saying it in order to be persuasive of the authenticity and the authority of Talmud Bavli. We go further. Let's go now to source number 2. Od mi Pirkoi ben Baboy. He says, Shamanu shabo etzlechem talmidim yeshiva. He's writing now, according to Shapansky, is writing to the Jews of Tunisia in this community of Kirwan. And he writes to them as follows. He says, we've heard that certain students came to you from a yeshiva, Umehen shahayu kodem be'eretz Yisrael, and they had previously been studying in Eretz Yisrael, these students from the yeshiva. V'noagu minhagei hashmad shenoagu bahen b'nei Eretz Yisrael, and they started to display practices in your presence, in your community, that are minhagei shmad, that are only minhagim that were imposed upon them because of religious persecution. Ve'achshav chamesh me'o shana shegozu shmad aleim shelo yisasku b'Torah v'noagu minhagei hashmad. He says, but you need to understand that there was a 500-year period in Eretz Yisrael where there was shmad in Eretz Yisrael, and that's the reason why certain minhagim arose in Eretz Yisrael which are not accurate. V'lo hinichu minhag hashmad ad hayom, and even to this day, the Byzantines do not allow the Jews in Eretz Yisrael to completely practice the way they're supposed to. Umiktsas yesh biyadam pirushim shel mishnah v'shel mixas talmud nashim. And as far as their Talmud study, as far as their Torah study, he says, they have some Mishnah commentary and they have some commentary on Seder Nashim. He says, V'chol echad ve'echad min hachachamim piresh l'daito ma sha'ala alibo. Unfortunately, he writes, that the guys that come from Eretz Yisrael basically say whatever they think is correct. They're just, they look at the text, and whatever makes sense to them is the way they explain it. Mipnei shelo hisigu min hachachamim harishonim sheyilamdu osam halacha l'maisa. And the reason for that is because they were not able to attain earlier wise men. They lost the Mesorah. They were not able to attain commentaries that are accurate from earlier generations. No one was able to teach them the correct explanation that they should know how to practice halacha l'maisa. And we're continuing along different sections of this letter. Sheminag shmad hu shegazer edom harisha shmad al Eretz Yisrael shelo yikru b'Torah. He says one of the minhagei shmad of Edom, which is the Byzantines, is that they shouldn't be allowed to study Torah, to read the Torah. The Ganzu kol Sifrei Toros mipnei shehayu sorfin osam. And the Jews, therefore, of Eretz Yisrael, were forced to put their Torah scrolls into hiding so that the Romans or the Byzantines should not burn them. Ucheshabo Yishmaelim lo hayu lahem Sifrei Toros. By the time the Yishmaelim came to Eretz Yisrael, which is, of course, we know that there was a constant power struggle back and forth between the Byzantines and the Muslims for control of the Holy Land. And eventually, when the Muslims gained ascendancy, this is being written before the Crusades, so it's in Islamic hands, Jerusalem and the rest of Israel, the rest of the Holy Land. The Jews, sadly, didn't have any more Sifrei Torah. Shehaya biyadam, shvelahayu lahem sofrim, shehaya biyadam halacha lemaisa, ke'ezet tzad ma'abdenes ha'orosu, ke'ezet tzad koisvim Sifrei Toros. There were no scribes to provide them with the Mesorah, even how to properly write a Sefer Torah, how to process the hides for cloth. V'hayilochin rik midei goyim shosum lichtov b'hem Sefer Avodah Zarah, v'hayikosim b'hem Sifrei Torah, and therefore they, out of a lack of knowledge, they took a very flimsy parchment called rik, which is what the idolatrous nations use to write their holy books. Perhaps he's referring to what Christians use to write their Bible, or what Muslims use to write their Quran. It's not clear what he's referring to. And he says, and that's because they didn't have anyone to teach them the proper laws of what to write a Sefer Torah on. And they still do this to this day, those in Eretz Yisrael. So this is his argument. Let's continue. Va'afhu kasav le'eretz Yisrael b'shvil sircha. He says, Rav Yehudai Gaon. Remember, we said that Pirkoi ben Baboy was a student of Rav Yehudai Gaon. And he writes that he had sent a letter, Rav Yehudai Gaon had sent a letter to people of Eretz Yisrael to argue with them about the laws of sircha. That when you find a sircha in a lung, when you find a tuberculosal hole, a puncture in a lung, you can't eat the animal, it's treif, right? It's a treifa. He says, Ubishvil kol ha-mitzvah shenogin bahen shelo kalach, and he wrote them about other things that they were doing improperly. Ella keminag shmad, velo kiblu mimenu. And he's realized that they were doing things that were based on religious persecution, that they were getting a lot of things wrong. But he also saw that they would not accept the law from him. V'sholchu lo minhag mevatel halacha. As they wrote to him, sorry, Rabbi, a minhag overrides halacha. So therefore, our minhag is to do certain practices, and therefore we're going to keep it that way. Uvikesh lihischazek aleihem v'hischazek shelo yehu apikorsin v'hiniachosa. So the way that the Shapansky writes in the footnote is what he means to say is that he wanted to be able to strengthen them, to be able to prevail over them, but instead he prevailed over himself by refraining from contacting them any further, because he realized that they were not going to listen, and his argument was mutav sheyushogigin val yu mezidin. Better that they should commit their errors unintentionally than intentionally, knowingly violate what he was sending to them. And like he says, shelo yu apikorsin, that they should not commit heresy by going against his wishes, and therefore v'hiniachos, and he left them alone. And basically he wrote them off, Rav Yehudai Gaon. He says, Teida lecha mipnei ma ochlin sircha b'Eretz Yisrael. He says, and I'll show you, he says, even to this day in Eretz Yisrael, the Jews have more lax standards of kashrus, and they will eat animals that have sirchas in their lungs. He says, mipnei she'ein b'yodam halacha echas mitalmud hilcha shchita v'lo miseder kodshim kulo. He says, because they don't have in their possession today, because of religious persecution, any of the halachas from the Gemaras in Chulin which talk about the laws of Sircha. They don't have Seder Kodshim, and therefore Nishtakach mehem Seder Kodshim Kulo, the Talmud Seder Taharos Kulo, and therefore they've forgotten all of these things.
Where's the Talmud Yerushalmi then?
What?
Where is it, the Talmud Yerushalmi?
What do you mean, where is it?
No, I mean...
They lost it, in other words...
Yeah.
So we found it later on?
No, we still don't have those parts.
No, but we do have a Chulin. We do have a lot of things. We have on Kachim and stuff like that.
Well, Kodshim, I don't think there's a Yerushalmi.
No, Shalmi.
No, there's no Yerushalmi on Kodshim.
But there's still a lot of stuff that even in the Eden don't know. So where does he think it is?
He's saying that remember, this is a polemic.
No, I understand, I'm just
So-
asking you.
right.
A Maisa question.
Right.
They
So he's saying that there is a Yerushalmi, but it's deficient. You have certain things but since you don't have a whole Seder Kachim in Palestine, so therefore you don't know how to conduct yourselves. Uvishvil shemolin umashlichen dam brisan al afar umuvazin dam bris shekaras HaKadosh Baruch Hu im Avraham Avinu. And another thing that they do incorrectly is that after they do a bris, they thrust the blood of the bris onto earth, whereas our minhag is to throw the blood into water. I'm not sure what the basis of this machlokus is, but that's another discussion. But it's another area where he's critical of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael for not doing according to the Masorah. Let's go on to the next page. And we'll skip to number Dalet. This is Mitshuvas HaGaonim Sefer HaEshkol. Sefer HaEshkol is written by Rabbi Avraham ben Yitzchak of Narbonne in France in the 12th century. The Sefer HaEshkol is a halachic work where he brings down different minhagim and different halachos of the Rhineland. And also he's also known as being the Rebbe of the Ravid. He was the author of the Hasagos HaRavid on the Rambam. Okay, so the Sefer HaEshkol quotes from Tshuvas HaGaonim, and he writes as follows, and this is very informative what the Sefer HaEshkol writes. He says, V'nishal Rav Hai was asked about a certain halachic issue, V'heishiv kol masha matzano b'Talmud Eretz Yisrael v'ein cholek alav b'Talmudenu, and he wrote as follows. He says that when it comes to something that you find in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is not contested by Talmud Bavli, or let's say the Yerushalmi provides an in-depth, proper reasoning for its psak, no chazenu v'nismoch alav, d'lo gora mipirushe harishon. We would always embrace the psak of the Talmud Yerushalmi in those situations, because certainly the Talmud Yerushalmi is no worse than something that we find in the Rishonim. In other words, something that we find in the commentaries to the Gemara Bavli. So therefore, what Rav Hai is essentially arguing is, it may not be as authoritative as the Talmud Bavli, but if it provides reasoning and provides logic that we don't find being contested by the Bavli, there's no reason for us not to accept it. Avol ma shematzinu shecholek al Talmudenu na'azvenu. But any time we find something in the Yerushalmi that is disputed by the Bavli, we have to put aside the Yerushalmi and not accept it. If you look at Shapansky's footnote in number 2, he says, V'chein posak harif b'sof erevin ayin lahalan b'tziyunim. He says the Rif writes exactly the same thing, and as we'll see later on. So the Rif also writes the same thing as Rav Hai. And so now the Sefer HaEshkol writes as follows. He says, V'ha d'tzam Rabbi Zera d'lishtakach Talmuda d'Bavloi minei. We know that there's a Gemara in Bava Metzia that Rabbi Zera fasted in order to forget all that he had studied in the Babylonian yeshiva. Now, that seems to be somewhat derisive of the Torah study in Bavel. And if you're telling me that the Talmud Bavli is more authoritative, then why did Rabbi Zera fast in order to forget what he had studied in Bavel? The Rabbi Yirmiyah Omar b'machashakim hoshivani, and furthermore, Rabbi Yirmiyah was quoted as saying, and this is in Sanhedrin, that when the pasuk in Eicha says that God has placed me in darkness, Ze Gemara Bavli. This refers to the Talmud Bavli, which is masked in darkness. It's embedded in darkness, which doesn't sound to be a very complimentary statement, right? Va'omar Navi, and he was further quoted as saying, he says, Bavloi tipshoi diyasvi ba'ara dechashocha amritun demechashaki. He says, you foolish Babylonians who sit in darkness, because Bavel has more darkness than Eretz Yisrael because it's in a valley. So it gets darker earlier and it gets lighter later in the morning. He says, you sit in darkness and therefore you say darkness, you say things that are dark, you say things that are not without light. So doesn't this indicate that Babylonian Talmud study is inferior to the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael? He says it's a question of history. He says, in the times of Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yirmiyah, it's true that Talmud study in Bavli was inferior to Talmud Eretz Yisrael. He says, but that was in that period of time, that in Bavli, things were not as good as they were in Eretz Yisrael, because after all, Eretz Yisrael still had a Sanhedrin. Now, what does he mean by a Sanhedrin? He doesn't mean literally an official Sanhedrin, because the Sanhedrin was already disbanded by the times of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And this is in the times of the Amorai. But he means to say that there was more of an official kind of rabbinic body that was present in Eretz Yisrael during the earlier period of the Amoraim. And therefore the study of Torah in Eretz Yisrael was superior. Right, so we talked a little bit about smicha as well. And so perhaps that's what he means, that there was still smicha being granted. Ugedolei hachachamim hayu be'eretz Yisrael, ugezeros merubos bebavel, kinamrinan b'shchitas chulin. He says, and we know that the majority of chachamim at that time, in the earlier period of the Amoraim, lived in Eretz Yisrael. And there were a lot of decrees made against the Jewish communities in Bavel at that time. As it says in Shchitas Chulin, pulmusa asala pumpadisa, that a pulmus, some kind of jolt, of flash, of pain, came to pumpadisa. The agav shmada nach nafshe, and it was because of shmad that Rabbi passed away. The Su Vadai Eretz Yisrael Niskad Shemikol Haratzos. And furthermore, we know that Eretz Yisrael, even if everything was being equal, Eretz Yisrael is superior because it's the Holy Land. As Rabbi Zera himself said, that the air of Eretz Yisrael itself makes one wise. So this is all true in the earlier period of the Amoraim. Eretz Yisrael is superior to Bavel, and there's a good reason why you'd want to fast to forget your Torah learning in Bavel. If you were going back to Eretz Yisrael, or you wanted to be able to collate the information that you had studied, you'd want to jettison what you learned in Bavel and only retain what you had studied in Eretz Yisrael. Avol bimei Rav Ashi v'Ravina haya shalom beBavel v'nafish shmada be'Eretz Yisrael. But by the time we get to the latter period of the Amoraim, by the Chasima Sashas, you find that in the times of Ravina and Rav Ashi, there was peace in Bavel, and there was shmad in Eretz Yisrael. V'im ata hara'a taman tuva, v'nachis man dahava taman. He says, and therefore you had a diminution of psak halach in Eretz Yisrael, and you had a diminution of people who were roy to be poskim in Eretz Yisrael. Kigon rabin v'ravdimi v'kulu nechusei denachten hacha. He says, and that's why you find that so many of the sages of Eretz Yisrael migrated to Bavel. Ruban Chakimei Darad Yisrael. Most of them were from Eretz Yisrael. They came to Bavel because they couldn't continue study in Eretz Yisrael. Va'amru miyamos Rabbi ad Rav Ashi lo matzino Torah ugdula b'makom echad v'hatar miskaberes v'holeches b'yamav. And the Gemara itself says, and this is a Gemara in Gittin, it says that from the times of Rebbe until Rav Ashi, there was no longer Torah and Gedula in one place until Rav Ashi came along, and Torah in Bavel increased and increased because of him and because of his generation. So Vadai Avira De'eretz Yisrael Machkim. But surely it's still true that the air of Eretz Yisrael makes one wise. Va'amru l'tzion yomar ish v'ish yulad ba, chad minayu adif kitrei minon. And it says, the Gemara says that based on this pasuk in Tehillim, that one of them in Eretz Yisrael is better than two of us. V'haninami havu hasam v'nafak minayu talmudeinu. He says that, like he says in the footnote, wrote Salomar, sha'af chachmei Eretz Yisrael hayu bebavel. B'shas Yisa Talmud Bavli. He says, and the wise men of Eretz Yisrael migrated to Bavel, and were there in the times of Ravina and Rav Ashi. Lachach adifa mi Talmud Eretz Yisrael. But that's the reason why our Talmud is superior to the Talmud Eretz Yisrael. Visu kamayu havu Talmud Eretz Yisrael biyadu taima dekadmoi v'heicha delo nichaluhu nadu min taima dekamaya. And then finally, the Sefer Eshkol says something very important. He's still quoting Rav Haigo. He says, you have to realize that the people who redacted the Talmud Bavli, already by that time they had in their possession the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Gemara of Eretz Yisrael. And whenever they found something erroneous that they didn't agree with in the Talmud Yerushalmi, they dissented from it. And therefore he says, Uklaluhu halacha kebasroi. And we have a general rule that we paskin like the latter opinion, the opinion which comes later. Now, where do we find this position? Halacha kebasroi. What?
It's in the Rif.
It's in the Rif. So, but the earliest period is from the Gaonim. So if you take a look at the footnote, in 24, he says, Klal ze halacha kebasroi ein makoro b'talmud, ela b'gaonim ha-rishonim. You find it in the earliest Gaonim. V'huzkar tchila b'seder tanoim v'amoroim, simin chafei. It's the first time you ever find it. You will not find this principle of halacha kebasroi in the Gemara itself. It's something that the Gaonim paskind on, that if we find someone from an earlier Talmudic period arguing with someone from a later Talmudic period, and they're both Amoraim, you would assume that the later Amoraic position is more authoritative because he was able to refine the previous opinion.
He mentions also note 25 in the Rif.
Yeah, so now if you take a look in note 25, he says, Nimog ze ha'achron shiroi lipso kebabli neged harishalmi mishum da halacha kebasroi kosov gamkin harif b'sof erufin v'zel lashona. He says, let's see what the Rif writes. He says, the kaven desugyan de gemara dilon lahefera lo ichbas lon b'mai da asri b'gemara de b'nei ma'arava. He says, even though it's true that the Talmud Bavli in this area of Eruvin that the Rif is addressing is more lenient than the Talmud Yerushalmi, which paskins aser, he says, we don't reckon with the Talmud Yerushalmi, dal gemara dilon samchinan de basroyu, because we always rely on the Talmud Bavli, which is more authoritative because it comes later. The ilav de kimlahu, the high member de bnei marav, alav de samchahu, lo kasharu le inhu. And because the rabbis in Bavel had the Talmud Yerushalmi in their possession, they would never have dissented from it unless they knew it well and they knew that it was incorrect. And so therefore this position, by the way, how much time how much time span difference is there between the authorship of the Yerushalmi and the Bavli? It's a machlokes. Some say a century, some say 300 years. And you can take a look at the footnote about the historicity of the time span, the time lag between Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. But this idea of halacha kebasroi is in itself not so clear when we apply and when we don't apply it. For example, we know that we have this principle of niskatnu hadoros, that the generations have gotten smaller or less as generations ensue. And yet, doesn't that seem to conflict with halacha kebasroi? So when do we apply halacha kebasroi, and when do we apply the principle of niskatnu hadoros? So obviously this has to be worked out very carefully, and now's not the time to do it. But basically, we know that there's a cutoff period of the Tanoim, and Amora cannot argue with the Tana, but a later Amora is considered to be more authoritative than an earlier Amora. It's a bit counterintuitive, right? So in the period of Amoraim, you go with the later Amoraim who have all of the data in front of them and can carefully select how they paskin. But even though they can't argue with the Tana, they can argue with an earlier Amora. Okay? We'll just do a little bit more. Actually, we'll just do this one, Shuvas Hagona Mitoch HaGeniza, another fragment that's found in the Geniza in Oz Hey. Umilsa de Psika B'Talmud Dilan Lo Samchinan Ba Al Talmuda de B'nei Eretz Yisrael. He says that which we find Piskei Halacha in our Talmud, whenever we find Piskei Halacha in our Talmud, we do not rely on Piskei Halacha that conflict in Eretz Yisrael, in the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael. Hoel v'shanim rabos ifsika hara mitaman bishmada. Since there were many years where there was a lack of the ability to paskin correctly because of shmad. V'hachahu d'isbarari maskana, and it's only therefore in Bavel where we're able to arrive at clarity. Aval milsa delesa la plukta b'talmud dilana chazinana madi'it marhasam. He says, but whenever you find something where there's no argument, we would consult the Yerushalmi to give us, to fill in the blanks of things that we don't have in the Talmud Bavli. Inami legluye tamad demilsa kigon pirusha da aravach be misvara hasam v'hachakuta or kushta. He says, and therefore, if you need to reveal some sort of truth that is based on logic, and the Yerushalmi provides something that logically is sound, we would rely on that. If it offers additional rationale and so forth, we would say that both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi are true when there's no conflict between the two of them. You definitely find among the Gaonim this sort of inferiority that is attributed to the Talmud Yerushalmi. And yet you also find that the Rambam gives a lot of deference to the Yerushalmi. You also find poskim in a later generation. The Aruch HaShulchan quotes the Yerushalmi quite often in order to augment an understanding of halacha. There's a lack of clarity, even to this day, as to the role of the Yerushalmi in Psak Halacha. When it comes to things that are clear in the Shulchan Aruch, then you can't obviously use the Yerushalmi. But how much can you use the Yerushalmi to provide insight into areas of halacha that are not addressed by the Shulchan Aruch? That's where you find this sort of gray area that the Yerushalmi is utilized by some Rishonim and Achronim, and it is not utilized at all by other Rishonim and Achronim.
Aren't there things in the Yerushalmi that we don't have in Bavli as well?
Sure, there are plenty of things.
One of his knocks against Yerushalmi was that Yerushalmi was missing things. We don't have everything, but there are things we don't have. We have to turn the Yerushalmi because it's dry. We don't have much of Bavli as far as I know.
That's true. Yeah, I don't. There's much more in it, but logically so, because Eretz Yisrael has a lot more agricultural halacha about Trumas Maisus and Shemitah, that is Lamaisa, that never had to be undertaken in Chutz La'aretz.
Are we saying that the transmission is deficient even if it's there?
Yes, they're saying the transmission is deficient even if it's there. The transmission is deficient, and therefore don't rely on it unless you find something that is logically sound in the Yerushalmi that doesn't conflict with the Bavli. That seems to be the consensus of the Gaonic literature. I just want to leave you with one idea. This is more now drush and the Netziv. You'll see this in the last page in the Hamek Davar. The Netziv writes on his commentary to Shmos Perek Lamed Daled, talking about the second Luchos. He tells us a very interesting yesod. He says that one of the differences between the first Luchos and the second Luchos is that the first Luchos were much more authoritative than the second Luchos, but also through their authoritativeness created more restriction on how they could be interpreted. In other words, he says, if you take a look, he says, he quotes a number of midrashim, and if you take a look, it's the first column, 3 lines from the bottom of the first part of the Hamek Davar, where he says, "V'hakavana b'chol zeh." He says the intent of all of these midrashim that I've quoted for you is to convey the following idea: De beluchos harishonos lo nitan koach hachidush elamash kibel Moshe diyuke hamikroos v'halachos hayotze mizeh. He says in the first set of tablets they were much more authoritative, but by that authoritativeness there was no ability to be mechadesh, to innovate new ideas outside of the specific rules that had been passed down in the first luchos. Avalo lechadesh devar halacha al yedei yud gimel midos uchedom havayos hatalmud. But there was no authority vested within Klal Yisrael in the first set of luchos, because of their greater level of authority, to utilize the hermeneutic principles that would allow us to derive law based on Torah Sheba'al Peh. There was not the Torah Sheba'al Peh that we have today, which allows for greater creative derivation, but rather only that which was passed down to Moshe Rabbeinu. And anything that was not part of a tradition, you could analogize, but there was no way to use hermeneutic principles for additional derivation. But with the giving or the granting of the second luchos, there was an additional gift or an additional latitude that was granted to Klal Yisrael, that anyone who possessed the proper methodology of derivation using the Yud Gimel Midos of derivation, he could actually innovate new halacha based on those Yud Gimel Midos as if he was able to apply them properly to the text. Ela shemitchila lo asku bazeh ela Moshe bizaro, uva'arvos Moav hochiach Moshe liyisrael sheyikablu zeh haderech k'moshe yavur reish sefer devarim. This is originally, these principles of derivation were only done by Moshe and his children, and then afterwards he shared them with the rest of Klal Yisrael as they came to the plains of Moab. B'chol zeh haya ha'egel siba lazeh shenigzar ubeyom pakdiu fakarati aleihem chatasam. This was a result of the sin of the Chet HaEgel, which was a game changer not only in a spiritual level of the Jewish people, but also in the way that they would be able to access Torah law. And it was also foreseen that they would also be exiled because of the sin of the spies. And this was the reason why that it was necessary for the Jewish people to learn how to derive halacha using certain hermeneutic methodologies for two reasons. That it was necessary to protect the unity of Klal Yisrael and to protect proper jurisprudence in Klal Yisrael. So there had to be a certain uniform methodology of law derivation to fill in all of the blanks that were not present when the Torah was given. And that's specifically why Hashem wanted the second tablets to be hewn by Moshe instead of being hewn by God. Lo mishum shelo zachu l'ma'aseh Elokim. This was not, as people think, because we didn't merit to have tablets hewn by God. Elo lahoros dahalacha hamischadashas b'koach luchos halalu hi hishtatfus amal ha'adam b'siyata dishmaya. But rather to demonstrate that from now on, Jewish law is a product of a partnership between man and God. That's what the second luchos represent. And we'll talk about that later on. He says, and that's why our sages tell us that what a student would innovate well down in the future was already alluded to in the luchos. And this is what the master means to say, that is quoted by the Ibn Ezra, that the second set of luchos are superior to the first luchos. That even though there was greater holiness in the first luchos, and therefore, if the tablets had never been broken, the first tablets, it would have been easier to arrive at a final psak halacha through just logic alone and being able to, what's called bimedam el milsa la milsa, to analogize different scenarios to the laws that were given. Aval kasher niskalkalnu, v'hinenu nitzrachim lios yegemu l'shanin charba shel Torah, lazem esugal yoser luchos achronis. But because we corrupted ourselves through the sin of the golden calf, it was now necessary to have certain hermeneutic principles passed down to us to enable us to derive law using more tools that were in our hands and more flexibility in being able to derive law, because now we were on a lower madrega and we no longer had the ability to take the pristine law and to extrapolate from it. So in order to be able to create proper law in every generation, we needed to be granted more flexibility using these Yud Gimel Midos in order to be able to extract law. But this is the point that he makes. He says, and then you go down to the next page. He says, he says that's the by analogy what the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli represent. He says, the Yerushalmi kedushaso rabba mehabavli basher nasa yedei amoroi kamoi. He says the Yerushalmi has a greater level of kedusha because it was written by earlier Amoraim. Uchamay merabba b'shnas o b'shabbos daf kuf lamedalid ana bahadi targimna Desabi Lamali. Like Rabbi had said in Masechah Shabbos, he says, why should I intrude in the explanations of the elders? I shouldn't get involved. They're more authoritative. He acknowledged that in earlier generations they got to the truth more authoritatively than he did. And furthermore, Talmud Yerushalmi is based on Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Mikol makom harei yadanu dekoach Talmud Bavli mechubad mehal Yerushalmi. But we also know, our Mesorah is that the Bavli is more authoritative than the Yerushalmi. The Alpha Gav Shenichra B'Sanhedrin Daf Chav Zayin B'Mechashakim O Shivani is a Talmud Bavli. And what about the Gemara in Sanhedrin that says that the Bavli is shrouded in darkness? He says Mikol makom eno legenai chas v'shalom, but that's not a pejorative. He says Elakocha hanifla lahayer halacha afilu b'mechashakim. But that's the koch of the Bavli, to illuminate halacha even amidst the darkness. Hainu b'Bavel b'chutz la'aretz she'ein ba'or eretz hakodesh. That even when there is a lack of holy light of Eretz Yisrael, the Bavli is there to shine a beacon. V'lulei koach haTalmud Bavli lo higani la'or hahora asham. Were it not for the Talmud Bavli, we would never have arrived at proper psak halacha amidst the darkness. He says that's like by analogy, the Talmud Yerushalmi is like the first luchos, the Talmud Bavli is like the second luchos. Me'ein zeh b'v'china elyona ha'yahevdel ben luchos rishonos la'achronos. And you can finish reading it yourselves, but that's what I wanted to provide for you tonight, and I'm sure there's much more to be said on this topic, but this is at least an introduction to why we consider Talmud Bavli more authoritative than Talmud Yerushalmi.